The snow seemed to be falling sideways that morning, as if the wind were in a hurry to sweep away any trace of human presence. It was Rachel's first day at Echo 9 Base, one of the most isolated and secret outposts in Antarctica. The sky, heavy and opaque, seemed to reflect the atmosphere inside the base. Cold, silent, suspicious. She stepped off the aircraft with a firm expression on her face, but inside she felt the tension of someone carrying not only a backpack, but also the eyes of an entire troop questioning her presence there. No one said, "Welcome." No one asked her name. One of the soldiers, barely hiding his contempt, whispered loudly enough for her to hear, "Too weak for the cold. This isn't summer camp." Rachel didn't react. It wasn't the first time she'd faced this kind of reception. But there, at the end of the world, every word weighed like ice on her shoulders. She was a communications technician, graduated with honors, fluent in Russian, and trained in polar survival. But none of that seemed to matter. To them, she was just the radio woman, the uncomfortable exception, the logistical error that would soon ask to return. She was assigned to a separate tent near the signal towers. It was the furthest from the mess hall and the closest to the biting winds. While the others shared camaraderie in the warm corridors, Rachel sat alone in front of the monitors, tracking signals, decoding patterns, and noting any anomalies. She didn't complain. Not once. It was as if the silence of Antarctica suited her. The first week they tried to ignore her. The second they began to test her. They left heavy boxes near the radio station, by mistake, for her to carry. They purposely knocked down cables or delayed reports to see if she would react. Rachel remained silent. She didn't respond to provocations, didn't ask for help. She simply did her job with surgical precision. She heard everything, the disguised jokes, the bets on how long she could last. But every offensive remark was turned into a focus. She knew she couldn't fail. Commander Ivanov, a stern and feared man, treated her with the same indifference he showed a wall. He never looked her directly in the eye. He never called her to a strategy meeting. To him, she was a piece of equipment, and pieces don't have opinions. But Rachel heard the codes, the noises, the radar's behavior. She knew something was wrong in that place, something no one wanted to see. One night, while the others slept, she went outside with a clipboard and noted the prevailing winds over the past 48 hours. She remapped the route based on the changes in the ice. She discovered that one of the emergency exits was partially covered, invisible to thermal radar. She kept this information to herself. She wouldn't be overheard, and she knew it. But she would keep paying attention. There was something about Rachel that few noticed. She observed everything. The soldiers' expressions when they returned from missions. The long silences in transmissions. The frequencies the devices discarded as reading errors. She ignored nothing, and she wrote everything down. She knew the exact time the commander spent on each patrol. She knew that 2 soldiers avoided going out in pairs. She knew that if the generator failed, there was a deactivated tunnel that no one else mentioned. Rachel wasn't known for her physical strength or her speeches. She was the kind of person others forget, until they desperately need someone who's seen what no one else has. The base operated like a closed system, everyone in their role, everyone in their place. But Rachel seemed to see through the facade of discipline. He knew that arrogance there could be more dangerous than the cold, and that silent contempt was like a virus. It spread quickly, contaminating reason. In her free time, she began studying the base's old maps. She sifted through files no one else opened. She found incident reports that had been shelved without explanation. One in particular caught her attention, a drone crash in an area where the ice should have been stable. When she reported this to one of the technicians, she received only a wry smile and the words, "Stop being paranoid. Here, it's the cold that kills, not the past." Rachel didn't answer. She just wrote it down. Until then, no one knew it, but she had already mentally mapped out every alternative evacuation route. She had already mentally organized each soldier's shifts, identified who was vulnerable on watch duty and who was more prone to panic. She didn't do this out of obsession. She did it because she knew. In extreme environments, the unpredictable doesn't forgive the inattentive. When the commander announced he would personally lead a reconnaissance mission, Rachel felt a chill that wasn't from the cold. She knew the area was unstable. She knew because she'd been hearing anomalous sounds on the radar for days. She tried to warn him. The commander didn't even look in her direction. That morning, as everyone geared up, she simply watched from the window. The group set off eastward, and silence returned to the base. But she sensed something was off in the air. If you've made it this far and feel captivated by this story, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel now. This helps us continue bringing you stories that reveal the unexpected and the unseen heroes who live among us. Now I want to hear from you. Has there ever been something in your life where no one believed in you, until you were the only one able to solve the problem? Leave a comment. Your story might inspire someone not to give up before the turnaround. The radio hissed hesitantly, as if the ice itself wanted to swallow the sounds trying to escape the base. That morning, Rachel knew something was about to happen. The weather was strange, the grey sky denser than usual, and the sensors she'd been watching so closely had shown unusual fluctuations. She alerted the officers, but got the usual. "Rachel, you're just a support technician. You don't need to worry about that." But she cared. From her first day at that base, from her first step onto that frozen ground, she realized that Antarctica held something the satellites couldn't pick up. Commander Ivanov was respected, straightforward, and rarely erred in his decisions. Upon receiving the report of strange tremors coming from the eastern side of the glacier, he didn't hesitate. He ordered an immediate expedition. Rachel asked to join the mission. She knew how to decipher seismic data like few others there, but once again her presence was dismissed. "This isn't the place for you," they said. Instead, he took 4 soldiers and 2 drones and departed with the coolness of someone who thought he'd be back before dinner. The first 2 hours were normal. Brief reports, drone footage showing the uneven surface, nothing major. Until, suddenly, silence fell like a blanket. The radio Rachel insisted on monitoring began to cut out. Fragments of voice echoed between metallic clangs. She heard something no one wanted to hear. "We're surrounded. Something's wrong with the ice." And then, absolute nothingness. In the command room, the tension was palpable. Technicians looked at each other, waiting for orders that never came. The second in command tried to re-establish contact, but the frequencies seemed to have evaporated. The commander's tracking device blinked, then disappeared from the panel. It was as if Antarctica itself had devoured the expedition. Rachel stood up, crossed the room, and stared at the digital map. They shouldn't be in that area. There's thermal instability under the ice sheet. There could be caves or air pockets, or worse. She was ignored. "Those maps are old," they retorted. "It was just sensor interference." But Rachel knew there was more to it than that. The commander's face in the last transmission was pale, frightened. He wasn't a man to be scared for no reason. And that final sentence, "We are surrounded." Surrounded by what? By whom? Or by something? She tried to search the mission logs, but the files were locked. Base security had changed protocol. "This is now a Level 2 issue. Only the military council has access." Still, she pressed on. She opened her own files, sifted through discarded transmissions, and cross-referenced seismic data from the past 5 days. And what she found took her breath away. A strange vibration pattern, as if something were moving beneath the glacier, something that was tracking the missing team. She took this data to the deputy commander. He laughed. "Rachel, you've been watching too many movies. Go to sleep. They must have lost the drones and headed for the alternate station. We'll find them soon." But they didn't find it. The next day, a new expedition was considered, but cancelled due to a polar storm. The helicopters were trapped in the hangar. The satellites showed no signal, and the soldiers began to whisper in corners. Some said they heard sounds coming from the east, like a deep, repetitive echo. Others dreamed of their commander, pale, standing on the edge of a crevasse. One of them woke up screaming, "It wasn't just the cold, it wasn't just the cold." Crisis ensued. Without leadership, the base became a constant tension. Rachel tried to remain calm, but every second was torture. She knew something was wrong, that the silence of the glacier was unnatural. She began writing everything down in a notebook: schedules, sounds captured, temperature changes, soldiers' reports. Little by little, she built a secret diary, as she no longer trusted anyone. She began scanning the sensors manually night after night, and one night she picked up a deep sound coming from the east. It was intermittent, rhythmic. She froze. It was Morse. She noted every pause, every pulse. And as she deciphered it, her blood ran cold. Down, no breathing, ice lives. She didn't understand, but she knew she wasn't imagining it. Someone, or something, was communicating. Rachel was no longer sleeping. She spent hours staring at the panel. When someone approached, she hid. She began to create a replica of the base map, overlaying the seismic fault lines with the points of the last recorded sounds. And there it was, a path. Like a trail that wound under the ice, leading from the point where the commander disappeared to an old sealed-off section of the base, considered inactive. She tried to talk to the engineers. She showed them the data. She was ignored again. "You're being paranoid," they said, but one of the technical interns, Marco, believed her. He began helping her in secret. Together they adjusted one of the external sensors to pick up subterranean frequencies, and the next morning the sound returned. Clearer, more direct. "Ice has fallen, life below, danger above." Rachel trembled. She knew she couldn't ignore it. He ran to the command room and requested access to the old room. He was denied. They threatened to transfer her to the base for insubordination, but she wasn't thinking about herself anymore. She was thinking about Ivanov. She was thinking about the others. Something had happened out there, something no one wanted to see. "What about you? Have you ever felt like you were right, but were disbelieved by everyone? Have you ever tried to raise awareness about something and been treated like a crazy person? Tell us in the comments. Your experience may reveal much more than you imagine." The silence on that base was more than the absence of voices. It was a sentence. Every soldier pretended not to see. Every officer looked away. And when Rachel spoke, everyone decided to pretend not to hear. It was easier to ignore her voice than to face their own fear. She wasn't wearing full field uniform. She wasn't wielding weapons. She wasn't wearing intimidating insignia. For many there, she was just the young meteorological technician, a useful presence in the statistics but dispensable in the decisions. But the weather didn't wait for approval, and the cold didn't respect hierarchy. The second in command, a man with eyes worn with fatigue and a soul frozen with routine, was clear. "Let's wait for the weather to clear." A phrase that sounded sensible to someone who had never had to rescue anyone outside of protocol. But Rachel could feel it. The wind was changing. The atmospheric pressure was plummeting. The silence between the peaks hid something greater. It was as if the ice itself wanted to warn, but no one wanted to listen, because listening meant acting. And acting required courage. Rachel wasn't a textbook heroine. She hadn't attended elite training or participated in any glorious operations, but she carried something no one there seemed to have: memory. She read everything. She sifted through old documents, discarded maps, reports no one read anymore. And in one of them she found the third route, an abandoned passage between the ice sheets, used decades earlier by a Russian team that never returned. Since then, that route had become the stuff of legend, until she found a forgotten draft in the protocol folder of the archive. She begged, not once, not twice. She asked them to at least check the possibility. She pointed to the weather forecast with data. It showed that the winds were converging abnormally. "If we wait another 30 minutes, no one will come back alive from that mission," she said, her voice trembling but firm. The silence that followed was more cutting than any order. And soon after, the verbal slap, "You're not trained for this, stay where you're needed," being useful. That sentence hit her like an iron fist in the face. As if all her dedication, all her intuition, all the time she'd spent studying the base, the ice formations, the Antarctic winds were worthless. It was as if only her position mattered, not what she knew. They wanted her where they could control her, behind a screen, logging data, obeying orders. But none of them knew what Rachel knew. And what she knew could mean the difference between life and death. The storm began to form with more violence than the satellites had predicted. Inside the base, communication antennas began to oscillate. Alarms, previously so silent, began to flash intermittently. But still, no one took the risk of taking action. The fear was so great that they preferred inaction. Waiting for the weather to improve was the perfect excuse to avoid the responsibility of a bad decision. But not deciding was also a choice, and time, merciless, continued to pass. Rachel, alone at her station, stared at the signals. The sensors screamed silently, but no one wanted to listen. The reconnaissance team's GPS had stopped emitting a signal more than 20 minutes ago. It was a glitch, they said. It happens often. But she knew better. When she suggested tracking using thermal triangulation on survival suits, they laughed. Nice technology, but that's just for lab testing. Once again, fear disguised as bureaucracy, cowardice disguised as prudence. Then Rachel made a decision no one expected. She grabbed her field backpack, pulled out the old map with the forgotten route, and descended the technical stairs to the drone room. She knew she couldn't go out alone. It was against protocol, but she could see, she could hear, and she could guide. She programmed the drone with the coordinates of the third route, adjusted its thermal sensors to detect any life forms, and manually launched it into the storm. Command knew. They wanted to stop her. But it was too late. The drone cut through the white sky like a silent arrow. For the first few minutes, nothing. No signal, no response. The officers laughed with suppressed nervousness, as if to say, "See? Nothing happened." But Rachel didn't blink. She stared at the screen, every cell in her body connected to that blinking dot on the radar. Until the signal appeared. 3 dots, then 5. Minimal movement. Bodies. Alive. The base plunged into sudden panic. The commander rushed down. "How did you know that?" She simply turned the monitor silently. That route no one wanted to consider, was the only one not covered by an avalanche. Rachel looked into their eyes. Now they wanted to listen to her. Now they were ready to act. But only because they had no choice. The silence at the base was now different. No longer the silence of omission, but the silence of shame. They knew. They had ignored it. They had chosen paralysis because they didn't believe that someone without rank, without a voice in meetings, without sufficient training could have the answer. But there, faced with the evidence, there was no room for pride. She didn't celebrate. She didn't shout. She didn't demand recognition. She simply returned to her station, programmed the drone's return path, and remained there, vigilant. While the others rushed to organize the rescue, she noted the time remaining before the next weather change, because someone needed to think about what came next. Now tell me, have you ever experienced something similar? Have you ever tried to warn someone and been ignored? Have you ever felt like you knew the way, but no one listened to you just because you weren't wearing the right uniform? Share in the comments. You could be the voice someone out there needs to hear. In the dead of night, as the base slept beneath the constant hum of wind turbines and the crack of ice in the distance, Rachel pulled on her last layer of thermals and strapped her flashlight to her forehead. Her hand trembled, but not from the cold. It was a mixture of courage, anger, and conviction. While many talked about making a difference, she was about to cross the line between talk and action. Every zipper zipped, every rope checked, was a silent pact with something greater than herself. The silence of the station contrasted with the noise in her mind. The commander's words echoed, "You're not trained for this kind of mission." But in that moment, she didn't need reassurance. She needed only her own decision. Beside the bed, she left a handwritten note in firm letters. "If I'm not back in 12 hours, consider track 3 compromised." It wasn't a cry for help. It was a warning. An ordinary woman would have backed away. But Rachel had already understood that waiting for recognition was a trap. Those who wait for permission to save the world end up buried by it. With cold fingers, she tucked the folded map into the inside pocket of her coat, next to the small notebook where she recorded the signals picked up by the sensors. The last one was clear: imminent risk. No one took it seriously. But she did. The first step outside the base was like entering another world. The sky was a colorless blanket. The snow a moving wall. The winds cut his face like blades, and each step was a negotiation with his own fear. His eyes burned, and his mouth froze inside. The temperature reached 35 degrees Celsius, and the winds blew at over 80 km/h. There were no stars. There was no sound, only his breathing muffled by the air filter and the occasional beep of the radio he carried in his left pocket. With each signal he picked up, his intuition ignited. It wasn't technical. It was something deeper. A kind of calling that can't be explained, only felt. The backpack was heavy, but it was her heart that carried the greatest burden. She knew what was at stake. If she was wrong, it would be just another mistake buried in the ice. If she were right, she could save dozens, but no one would know. Yet. Trail 3 was known for its seismic fault lines, for cracks that appeared without warning. Rachel walked on the balls of her feet, feeling the crackle of the ice beneath her boots, as if the ground were breathing irregularly. It wasn't just a hike. It was a spiritual journey. Her body led the way, but her soul resisted at every turn, on every slope covered by an invisible layer of thin ice. There was no heroism here, just a woman tired of being ignored. The flashlight on her forehead cast a weak beam, swallowed by the blizzard. But she didn't stray. Every kilometer she activated a flare to mark the way back. But deep down she knew there might be no turning back. The radio crackled, and between the noises she caught broken snippets of a code sequence. She wrote it down again. The letters formed another word. Fall. The same place where the commander had disappeared 2 days before. The base had suspended the search. They said the chances were slim, but Rachel remembered his tone of voice during their last contact. He was afraid. And she recognized fear like no one else. Not because she had overcome it, but because she had survived it so many times without anyone seeing. After nearly 4 hours of walking, she reached the section of the map that indicated the commander's last known location. The compass spun disoriented. The GPS wavered. But she kept going. The snow grew thicker, as if the world were trying to hide something. And then, a faint glow on the ground. Rachel dropped to her knees and dug with her bare hands, heedless of the pain. She found a piece of metal, part of a transmitter. It still worked, emitting a faint signal. The commander was there, or had been. The footprints around her had already disappeared, washed away by the storm. But instinct told her she was close. The last 3 hours had been the hardest. Her knees were giving out. Her fingers were barely responding. She chewed on a flavorless energy bar just to stay conscious. And it was as she crested a ridge of ice that she saw it. A crevasse. Deep, silent, with ropes hanging down and a pole attached to the entrance. She descended slowly, securing the hook to her waist, driving the spikes into the ice's edges. Every meter was a calculated risk. The silence inside the crevasse was absolute, like the inside of a tomb. But there was something there, a sound, a faint breath. And then, at the bottom, covered by a makeshift thermal tarp, he was. Alive. Frozen, dehydrated, but alive. Rachel didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just opened her backpack, injected an emergency dose of adrenaline into his arm, activated the contact heater, and attached the transmitter to a makeshift antenna. She climbed back to the surface and fired 2 flares. Red smoke sliced through the white sky. The base picked it up. It would take 3 hours to reach them. Rachel covered the commander and remained beside him. She squeezed his hand, even though she knew he could barely feel it. She simply said, as if to herself, "You won't die here. I came for you. I chose to come." And that was all. The next morning, when the rescue team arrived, they found the two together. He was semi-conscious. She was awake, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She said nothing. She simply pointed to the crevice and handed him the map. Then she walked back on her own 2 feet. Reporters tried to approach her. The soldiers applauded silently. But Rachel went straight to the mess hall. She poured herself some coffee and sat alone. She knew she had changed the course of things, and even if no one ever said it out loud, the station would never be the same after that dawn. Now tell me, have you ever made a decision that no one understood, but that changed everything in the end? Comment below. Maybe your courage will inspire someone else's. The snow was unforgiving. The wind was razor-sharp, and visibility was nearly nil. Rachel walked, her muscles screaming with exhaustion, but her eyes fixed on the white horizon. With each step, the certainty grew. If she didn't find them soon, it would be too late. The base had miscalculated the storm's timing, and yet no one would listen to her. No one believed her when she said the sensors showed abnormal pressure in the glacier's lower layer. Now here she was, the radio silent, her mental map nearly erased by fatigue, and only the faith that there was still something to be saved. In the 7th hour, when her feet could no longer distinguish ice from stone and her face bled from the cracks of the cold, Rachel saw it. A scrap of red fabric frozen to a broken bush. She ran. She found a backpack covered in caked snow, part of a damaged transmitter, and tracks half erased by recent winds. This wasn't just a clue. It was confirmation that someone had fought to survive, that someone had left signs before disappearing. With the flashlight strapped to her chest and her fingers numb, she followed the tracks to a deep crevasse. The climbing rope he carried attached to his belt was his only link to life at that moment. She clipped it on, climbed down, and what she saw, she would never forget. Below, a blue glow reflected in ice crystals illuminated the disaster scene. The commander lay beside a broken metal plate, his ankle crushed between two blocks. Dried blood had crusted over. One of the soldiers lay sprawled, his eyes open dully, a helmet lying cracked beside him. The other, younger, mumbled incoherently, huddled like a child. A third remained motionless, staring into space. It was as if they had crossed the border between reality and the abyss. Rachel didn't have time to cry or hesitate. The mission was now clear. No one else would come, no one else could. She organized an emergency shelter with the materials she found, reinforced the roof with fitted ice sheets, activated the emergency thermal packs, and covered the survivors. She grabbed the emergency transmitter and made improvised modifications using wires and the spare battery she kept close to her body. She tried the signal. No response. They were on their own. As the commander groaned in pain and the others' eyes pleaded for direction, Rachel became the commander they needed. She supported them, distributed rationed water, warmed them with her own body heat, and kept everyone awake with firm conversations until the weather played in their favor. When the weather gave a break of a few hours, she did the impossible, strapping the commander to her back using ropes, belts, and parts of a makeshift tent. She carried him alone for nearly 2 kilometers across the unstable ice, dodging cracks, braving violent gusts, slipping, falling, getting up. Every meter was a scream, every step a battle against physical collapse. Halfway there, she had to stop. The commander was beginning to lose his mind. His eyes fluttered open and closed. Rachel yelled at him, cupped his face with trembling hands, and ordered him to stay awake. And he did. Because of the authority in her voice, the fire in her eyes, something inexplicable screaming inside her. Because when everything falls apart, it's the invisible force that moves us, the strength of those who have been ignored, demeaned, and cast aside. And yet, they choose to carry on their shoulders those who once turned their backs. Upon reaching the rescue point, she fell to her knees. The transmitter she had programmed automatically went off. In less than 30 minutes, an emergency team appeared on the horizon. They found her hugging the commander, shielding him with her body. When the paramedics pulled her away, she simply asked, "What about the others?" Because the mission, for her, was never about status. It was never about recognition. It was about soul. It was about purpose. And it was there, in that snow marked by footprints of sacrifice, that history began to change. She didn't ask for help. She was the help. She wasn't appointed leader. She became leader. She wasn't saved by the system. She saved those the system abandoned. And when the base, days later, learned everything, when the emergency report described her every action precisely, there was no longer any way to ignore it. Now tell me, have you ever seen someone who was left out, discredited, humiliated, and yet was the one who held it all together when the world fell apart? Share your story in the comments. Maybe your story will inspire others not to give up. When the helicopters broke through the polar fog, it was too late for any gesture of recognition. Rachel was there, slumped on the hard ice, her eyes closed, her lips cracked, and her body hunched over with extreme exhaustion. She carried on her shoulders more than the weight of the 7-hour walk through an ice storm. She carried the absence of applause, the cruel silence of the systems, the echo of injustice. She had brought the commander back, alone. Without rescue equipment, without backup, without moral support. Only faith, instinct, and a determination no one there would have dared imagine she possessed. The commander survived. He was taken directly to the medical unit, where he received the necessary care. The other trapped soldiers were also rescued. The operation was recorded in the station's archives as a success, and in the official reports, not a single line mentioned Rachel. Not a single word about the soldier, who, even with injured fingers and burning lungs, followed tracks no one else dared to pursue. The report was cold, impersonal, and technical. Team rescued thanks to tracking signals. That was the sentence that summed up the heroism of an invisible woman. Rachel didn't question. She didn't demand. She didn't demand a single minute of camera time or platform time. She returned to base still weakened, her movements slow and her gaze distant. She walked through the corridors where she had previously heard whispered jokes. She entered the medical bay on her own. She refused admission. She simply asked for a few minutes to rest. No one stopped her. No one celebrated her. And in that uncomfortable silence, something was born that recognition systems can't measure. True respect. The following days were spent in containment, adjustments, and restructuring. Technicians flew in from the mainland to assess the damaged systems. Military psychologists interviewed the survivors, and even under investigation, even with so many questions being asked, no one seemed willing to listen to the only voice that truly knew what happened out there. Rachel remained on the sidelines, as if her presence bothered her, as if the truth she represented was too uncomfortable for the protocols of a base where medals often come before actual merit. Inside the base, the silence screamed. The soldiers who had once mocked her now averted their eyes. The commander, embarrassed, avoided her. A more sensitive officer occasionally offered her tea, a timid gesture of informal recognition. But she knew. That didn't make up for the pain. It didn't make up for the omission. It didn't cleanse the soul of someone who risked everything for a group that considered her useless. In the kitchen, she resumed chopping vegetables with the same precision as before. But her movements carried something new. The memory of a solitary journey, of a courage that no longer fit within standardized uniforms. She was no longer just Rachel. She was now the woman who had gone to the ends of the earth and returned with a life in her arms. And no one could erase that, even if there were no photos, no statistics, no ceremony. One morning, a young soldier approached. He had been one of those rescued. He stood before her, embarrassed, holding a folded note. He simply said, "Sorry about before." She didn't respond. She discreetly opened the note. On it was a map. It was the route she had taken, and next to it, in crooked letters, the phrase, "You saved us." "I know." Rachel calmly folded the paper and put it in her uniform pocket. Days later, a new leadership team took over the station, a colonel with a history of humanitarian missions. During the first meeting with the team, he asked to learn all the base's security protocols. Someone suggested, "Talk to Rachel. She knows everything. She was the one who mapped out the route during the evacuation." The sentence fell like a thunderclap in the room. For the first time, her name was pronounced firmly, without mockery, without irony, just recognition. The colonel asked to see her. They talked for long minutes. She explained the flaws in the structure, the planning errors, the forgotten routes. He listened silently, taking note of every detail. At the end, he extended his hand and said, "What you did, I will no longer be invisible." But Rachel merely nodded. She didn't want statues. She simply wanted the truth to have a place. And in that moment, for the first time since the rescue, she felt that something was truly changing. She wouldn't be honored on national television. She wouldn't win medals or make headlines. But something began to echo through the station's icy walls. Her name. Newcomers began seeking her out with questions. Officers, previously indifferent, began including her in meetings. And although there was no official ceremony, everyone knew there was a living legend among them. One who walked against death, who defied logic, who did the impossible without asking permission. And even if the outside world never knew her name, inside, where the cold tests the soul, Rachel left an indelible mark. Because you don't need applause to be a giant. All it takes is courage. Have you ever met someone who did something extraordinary, but was forgotten by books? Tell us in the comments. Let's give voice to these silenced stories. She didn't ask for recognition. She didn't need it, because something inside her changed forever. After that night, the commander disappeared. After 7 hours of darkness, biting wind and loneliness, something inside Rachel cracked. But it was precisely into that crack that the light entered. When she staggered back to base, clutching the captain's coat as proof she hadn't given up, everyone fell silent. Not in pain, but in reverence. In the days that followed, she didn't seek the spotlight. She didn't give speeches. She didn't assert herself. She didn't shout. She returned to her role at the radios. But now when she spoke, everyone listened. It was as if that walk through the storm had brought back not only a lost man, but a truth everyone had forgotten. Courage doesn't shout. It just acts. And when courage comes from within, it doesn't need a uniform or applause. The commander, still recovering, began subtly mentioning her in meetings. Not as a hero, but as a benchmark. If she could cross Track 3 alone, then no one would have any excuses anymore. The base map was updated, and now next to the conventional routes, a red highlight read, Emergency Evacuation Track, activated by Rachel M. during the Alpha Zero mission. A crooked, improvised line drawn by the courage of someone everyone deemed incapable. Next to the cafeteria, where they used to laugh at her, they pasted a note on thick paper by hand with a phrase that no one else had the courage to remove. Too weak for the cold. Weak is the memory of those who forget those who save. It was a silent but definitive response to the previous jokes, the hidden prejudice, the arrogance of those who confuse strength with appearance. Now, whenever a new team member arrived at the polar base, the ritual repeated itself. Between technical instructions and safety rules, someone would pull out a chair, point to the icy wall and say, "Want to know what it's like to survive here? Listen to Rachel's story." And then they told stories. They spoke of the cook, the radio operator, the ignored soldier, the woman who crossed the white abyss, alone, with time against her and fear for company. They spoke of the snow that nearly blinded her, the silence that nearly broke her, but also of the strength no one saw until it was too late to deny it. But what no one knew was that Rachel wasn't the same anymore either. In the solitude of the tent, away from prying eyes and meetings, she wrote, not diaries, not mission reports, but prayers, loose verses, scribbled on crumpled sheets of paper. Words that blended ice, faith, and a new conviction, that no one returns the same from a calling that demands everything of you. Something had awakened, something that had perhaps always been there, but only revealed itself when the world collapsed, and she chose not to collapse with it. She stopped trying to prove something. She started living with purpose. And when someone asked her how she managed to spend 7 hours in the middle of nowhere, with zero visibility and death all around her, she simply said, "I wasn't alone," because it really wasn't. And that's where the story changes. Because it's no longer just about Rachel, it's about all of us. How many times have we been judged from the outside, ignored, ridiculed? How many times have we believed ourselves weak? Until the storm forced us to prove otherwise, and when the storm passed, what remained? Fear, trauma, or a new awareness of who we truly are? Rachel didn't seek to be remembered, but she was. Because truth doesn't need a microphone, it just needs someone to live it fully. And that's why you're here now, because somewhere along your path, there's a calling. And maybe you too need to cross a seemingly impossible ice. But if this story touched you, if something inside you was awakened, then don't ignore that feeling. Leave a like if this message resonated with you. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next video, because in the next one, we'll reveal what Rachel found under the ice and why it wasn't in any official report. Do you think she just survived the cold, or was something else guiding her through that darkness? Reply in the comments, and get ready. What comes next goes beyond what the eyes can see.